Hello. Before we take on the last DLC area, there is something that I want to attend to.
You are here.
The Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant.
Now,
We joined this covenant a while ago, but we never really went into what exactly it entailed. We entered one of the dark chasms of old and promptly fell off a cliff.
chasm is not normally open. If you seek the dark, young undead, you must offer a human effigy. Young undead, may the dark shine your way.
So basically how it works is, at each location that we met Grandal, there is a portal type thing that we can open with a human effigy. Each portal leads to a different dark chasm of old. Inside these chasms, we take on the appearance of a black phantom, and we must explore the area and clear it out of enemies. The dark chasms are fairly unremarkable geographically, except for the fact that there's holes everywhere, so be careful of that. Cast light can help, but it's generally light enough to see and hear that you don't need it. You can also use these holes to your advantage, which I'll show off later. Now, the enemies in the Dark Chasm of Old are somewhat special. You have a variety of other Black Phantom NPCs, as well as those odd witch tree things. These Black Phantoms can be very difficult, especially if you take them on more than one at a time. So, a big part of actually doing these dungeons successfully is simply taking it slow and being careful with who you pull out and when. In this dungeon, or I suppose I should say chasm, we have an enemy that dual wields toxic daggers, an archer, and a witch tree. As things go, they're not awfully dangerous, though the witch tree does like to make a nuisance of himself. Ironically enough, the archer tends to be much less dangerous at a distance because he's not very accurate with his bow, though he will two-hand his sword once you get close, which can be troublesome. Now, with the witch tree and the archer, we were sort of pinned down here because there's so many projectiles flying at us. However, with the fire snake pyromancy that we got from Broom Tower, we can actually just take out the witch tree in one shot. Fire snake is extremely powerful, can hit multiple enemies, casts quite quickly, and in general is just really strong. It requires 2 attunement slots, though. And of course, like most powerful spells, it only has a couple of uses, so if you want to get a lot of use out of it, you need to bring some amber herbs with you. This structure is the ultimate goal of each dark chasm. You need to bring a fire butterfly with you, just so you can light a torch. By lighting a torch, you can then set light to this. With that done, the way is now clear to the exit, more or less. There are still some enemies left in this dungeon. Once you clear out all the enemies and light the torch, you are free to leave, and the chasm is clear. This is probably the most involved Covenant in the game. Not only does it have a fairly hefty single-player aspect, there's also a multiplayer aspect as well, because you can invade in these dark chasms. It works a bit differently than standard invasions. Now, some of these Black Phantoms are actually characters from the first Dark Souls. If this one is, I don't recognize him. But in our very first foray, way back when, we did run into a Black Phantom of Havel the Rock, a fairly infamous NPC from the first game that liked to hide in tower and crush people. I'm not sure that would help. When you find a hole covered with mist like this, this is actually safe to drop down and will simply take you out.
Young undead, the dark beset upon you runs deeper than I had imagined. Let us see just how much dark you can endure. You have seen dark that has existed from times long past. What once was a great void of darkness became but fragments. But slowly, the scattered fragments grew, absorbing all things. It is we who will be pilgrims to these sacred sites.
By clearing one dungeon, we gain a rank up in the Covenant, as well as a free copy of Resonant Soul. I figure since we're here, we'll buy the last 2 human effigies.
May the dark shine your way.
Now, one of the troublesome things, I suppose I would call, about this Covenant is actually getting to some of the warp points is kind of a pain in the ass. Most especially the one in Black Gulch. Before we do that, though, let's check in with our friend Shalqua.
You'll find a great creature far to the east. A colossal thing with the strength to match its size. Or something playing the part at least. Open the door and venture inside, and you'll soon smell even lovelier.
Later in the game, Shalqua does tend to have hints about where to go, even if they don't make a whole lot of sense. Mostly, though, I just wanted some more homeward bones. I'm running low. Now, if you recall, the way to this warp point is actually down on that hidden ledge that led to the giants. So just getting there is going to be a pain. And of course we have to contend with the poison-spitting statues and the tunnel worms. Tackling it from this direction was actually kind of a mistake, to be honest. At this point I'm sent scurrying back to the bonfire to recuperate. Because you really don't want to tackle a Dark Chasm of Old without a full inventory. You want to be prepared for just about anything in there, because you can get invaded, and the enemies are quite tough. The reason that one might want to invade in the Dark Chasm of Old is that if you are successful, you'll actually get a free bonfire aesthetic and a human effigy. That makes them an effectively limitless source of bonfire aesthetics if you need them. Though, to be honest, I don't think I'll ever quite make use of that feature because bonfire aesthetic farming is really dumb and I don't like it. Having to burn one just to make one enemy respawn each cycle is really dumb. At any rate, here we are.
Finally, now young, the master people. Young and dead, may the dark shine your way. May the dark.
Grandel doesn't actually have an awful lot to say, to be honest. Lots of dark shining the way, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Our first opponent in this particular chasm is quite fearsome. This Black Phantom is wielding the Ironclad set, as well as twin Great Hammers. I also pressed the wrong button. For better or for worse, this guy is quite resistant to fire, so Fire Snake isn't going to avail us much. His armor is also somewhat problematic. Mostly because it prevents backstabs, which would be a fairly significant weakness of such a slow build. Instead, we're simply going to have to do things the old-fashioned way and take it slow and steady. Despite his armor, he can still be staggered fairly easier with the Santier's spear, so once we get an assault going, we can sort of keep him stun-locked okay. However, as one might expect, his twin Great Hammers will do an enormous amount of damage if he gets more than one or two swings on you, so be careful. Now this is actually a familiar face. This is Xanthus King Jeremiah, a somewhat infamous phantom from the first game that showed up in the painted world of Ariamis. He wears some unusual clothing and is quite fond of pyromancy. In the Dark Chasms, he has access to some powerful spells, including one that we haven't actually seen yet. I'm not sure if he uses it here because I kill him kind of quickly, but it can catch you very much off guard if you're not careful. The witch trees are really not much more than annoyances. Their spells don't do an awful lot of damage, and they're fairly weak compared to everything else, so they're mostly there to just knock you over. Potentially into a pit, so it's not like they're not a threat. This somewhat mean-spiritedly placed torch brazier? I'm not quite sure what this thing is. Sort of Olympian in nature, honestly. Either way, it's placed sort of meanly, because if you're not paying attention, it's pretty easy to just tunnel in on it and walk straight into that hole. Now, this final room can actually pose quite a bit of a challenge. Not only is there another copy of the Xanthus King, there's another great hammer-wielding guy down there. And you pretty much have to deal with both of them at once, at least to some degree. As I have aptly demonstrated, simply trading blows with the Great Hammer guy will not get you much of anywhere, except possibly an early grave. The one-handed stance of the Santier Spear is actually pretty helpful here, simply because it's quicker and it has a lot of range, and it can still stagger him because it does a lot of damage. The Twin Blade form does more damage, but that was safer. Now, with those two spellcasters there, I do want to take this a little bit more safely, so I decide to go ahead and burn an Amber Herb and get another charge of Fire Snake. I also pressed the wrong button again because in Bloodborne you use the item button to use magic. I believe he just used Forbidden Sun there, which is a huge fast-moving fireball. Does a lot of damage. Comes out quickly. Eventually we'll have access to that, but not for a little bit. Since I botched my earlier spell cast by drinking instead, I decided to take on a different strategy and simply isolate the two enemies. Jeremiah does not have a lot of endurance, so he goes down fairly quickly. However, fire would not do much to phase him, since that's kind of his specialty. Come to think of it, I think that Fire Snake would have failed anyway because it tends to interact weirdly with ledges, since it moves along the ground unlike just a normal projectile. That's 2 dungeons cleared. Though this one does not give us another Covenant rank.
Not yet.
Figure I might as well buy some of the hexes he has for sale.
Shine your
At this point, I'm sort of rolling in souls without much to do with them. Our final destination is actually where we first entered one of the chasms, under Castle Dranglake. I would recommend saving this one for last for a couple of reasons that will become apparent. For one, there's a bonfire right next to it, so if for some ridiculous reason you end up failing, how would that ever happen, you can simply come right back to it without doing anything particularly obnoxious. Going into this chasm, I wanted to switch up my spells a little bit. I still want some fire damage on me, but force will actually be incredibly helpful here. Though it also occurs to me, almost belatedly, that would probably be a good idea to have a catalyst of some sort capable of casting force. I also make a couple of other preparations.
Fine. Yum. The mouth, if...
Looks like that guy had the same idea as me. It's nice when you just sort of see other people doing the same thing across worlds. It's one of my favorite sort of tertiary features of this game. It's not really something that makes or breaks it, but it is nice. It's just something that no other game series really does. Unless it's like an MMO or something, in which case that's kind of different entirely. I would say that this is probably the chasm that is the most difficult. However, there are ways to make it a little bit smoother. First up is Havel the Rock. This guy's enormous great hammer, the Dragon Tooth, as well as his great shield, are extremely difficult to deal with. However, you don't really need to. Sometimes gravity is all the help you need. Because he's so eager to charge you onto this narrow walkway, simply knocking him off with force is a fairly simple matter. Now, this customer I underestimated quite severely. That is Ricard, the person for whom Ricard's rapier is named after. And I assumed, foolishly, since he was using a light weapon, he would not have much poise. However, he was actually kitted out in some fairly heavy armor. So, I paid the price for my arrogance. And now I need to reopen the way with another human effigy. A trip to the Shrine of Amana to farm these might be in order the first time you try this quest. You can burn through them quite quickly if you're still trying to feel your way out. Fortunately, since the quote-unquote bonfire run is pretty short, we didn't lose that much time. We just need to deal with Havel again, which is pretty simple. Now, he can absolutely destroy you if you let him. Fortunately, it's pretty easy to just not give him the chance if you spam force. Now, I am somewhat more mentally equipped to deal with this guy now, though he is still pretty darn strong. His rapier does a lot of damage, it has a lot of reach, and it comes out quickly. Like, I was actually pretty darn surprised by how powerful he was. I didn't remember that. Fortunately, he is weak to backstab since he's not wearing any sort of ironclad armor. and the witch trees are just kind of there. They will also sometimes drop bonfire aesthetics, which is nice. They're pretty much the only items you can pick up in this place. I'm not sure who this is supposed to be, if anybody, but she is also quite easily defeated by force because she likes to fight near that hole in the ground. Now, of course, we do need to light that. We need to light the torch before we can actually leave. So that also means we have to find the torch. This one is kind of well hidden, at least compared to the others, which are more or less in plain sight. Alright then, that's all 3 torches lit. Now we just need to leave and we'll be done. Or will we? No, not quite. There is actually one more thing we need to do down here. Before we drop down this hole, there are a couple of preparations that I want to make. Primarily, what I want to do is jack up my dark defense as much as I possibly can. Unsurprisingly, the dark armor set will be quite effective in doing so. It has high dark resistance. And I guess I'll put on the mannequin mask since it has high dark resistance too, even though I look stupid. The Dark Quartz Ring plus 3 that we picked up back in the Sunken King DLC, as well as this Dispelling Ring plus 1, will also bring our dark defense up by quite a bit. Over 500 now, which is pretty significant. And here I do something very foolish. I completely forget that there's actually a loading screen between me and my destination, so I go ahead and buff myself up before I fall. That effectively wastes those items, and now we're thrown into combat with the Dark Lurker. This Diablo-looking motherfucker is not too difficult to deal with. Unlike a lot of bosses in the game, he seems to prefer magical attacks. Most of them are reasonably easy to avoid. However, the attack wherein he summons a homing dark sphere is actually pretty difficult to dodge. I don't really have a consistent way of doing it, mostly because I don't fight this boss very often. Those Forbidden Suns that he launches are actually fairly damaging, and they have some splash damage to them, but rolling will tend to do it. Fortunately, since we have such high dark defense right now, the dark spheres don't do that much damage. Though, when one of the Forbidden Suns sort of goes in a weird direction, that's trouble. Despite the fact that the Dark Lurker does use the occasional fire attack, he is quite weak to fire himself. He is even more weak to lightning, but I don't really have a reliable lightning attack source. I don't really have the equivalent of lightning great combustion, sadly. This is where the fight can get tricky. Hitherto, it was fairly manageable. You simply need to dodge his attacks or heal through any that hit you. However, at around, I guess, one-third of his health, I think, maybe more like 1/4, he will split into two. And that's not good for business. He retains all of his attacks in the split form. So, depending on your luck, you can easily end up in a situation where the screen is just filled with projectiles that you're not all that well equipped to dodge. I would say that the best way to deal with this is to simply stick on one as much as you can. That way you at least ensure that one of them only uses the fairly easy to dodge melee attacks. It also ensures that you can keep damaging them. They share the same health bar, so you don't actually ever need to attack the other one. If you simply do enough damage to the first one, you can get through the fight before the second one really has enough time to do anything. The Dark Lurker fight is pretty neat. It's honestly kind of a shame that most players will probably never see it because it's so well hidden. For a victory, we get a fairly significant number of souls, as well as the Dark Lurker's unique soul, which will let us buy Life Drain Patch from Strayed.
I knew that you were special. There is more dark within you than even you know. Dark is the mother of all. All things were born from it. May the dark.
Now, somewhat interestingly,
Young undead, you've discovered the truth.
Somewhat interestingly, Grandal interrupts me with more rambling about dark.
A deep, deep dark it is. The dark that we must all face. We need the abyss more now than ever.
At any rate, you actually get two separate Covenant ups from that. The first one comes from lighting the third torch. The last one comes from defeating the Dark Lurker.
These to you. Take them on your pilgrimage.
Once you achieve maximum rank, you get the Xanthus King set, which is pretty goofy, and you can also get the Dragon Chime by talking to him. It's sort of rude that they put that sort of hidden away behind all this other hidden shit, but the Dragon Chime is actually the strongest scaling faith chime in the game. It requires 50 faith to use, of course, so you have to pay the price for that. Okay, sure. The Xanthus set, as goofy as it looks, actually has some pretty nice resistances, and it doesn't weigh very much, so it's definitely a reasonable choice for a sort of medium character. And the crown is technically a mask, so it's on brand. I guess we'll just have to let that sink in for a bit. Next time we will go to the last DLC area and settle accounts there. For now, may the dark shine your way.